Over the course of his lifetime, Rajendra Chola, the most famous Chola king, had become quite possibly the richest man on earth. It was under his command that the Chola armies burst onto the Deccan Plateau, conquering most of southern Karnataka and along the east coast of India almost up to Odisha. He defeated the Pandyas and the Cheras multiple times and had set up the first Tamil outpost on Sri Lanka. Not only that, he'd also built the tallest temple in the world, the Brihadishwara, which became the central node of his political power as kingdoms from all over South India sent gifts and tributes to the temple, which were distributed and reinvested for the welfare of the kingdom. And now, his son Rajendra Chola had a big problem. His father was the most famous man in the Indian subcontinent, but he was just a young prince with no experience running a kingdom. How could he live up to the insanely high expectations set by the great Raja? Not only that, but his father had also picked a fight with the biggest kingdom in the Deccan, the western Chalukyas, locking their two empires in a vicious rivalry. Would the Cholas be able to beat them? In part 1 of this series, I showed you how the Cholas went from a minor Tamil kingdom to the most powerful military power in South India. In this episode, you will watch as the Cholas rose to the peak of their power in the most unexpected international invasion, the bitter Chola-Chalukya rivalry that almost destroyed both kingdoms, and how the Cholas managed to survive the endless warfare and bloodshed only to face their ultimate downfall due to the greed of their own vassal lords. This is part 2 of the complete history of the Chola Empire, made possible by the comprehensive work of Anirudh Kanisetti in his brand new book, Lords of Earth and Sea. Towards the end of his life, Rajaraja had shifted his focus from conquest to consolidating the power and alliances of his court. The Cholas had built up a vast treasury, which the royal women were using to strategically build connections across the various regions of the kingdom. And it wasn't just Rajaraja's queens either. Kundavai, Rajaraja's elder sister, was gifting beautiful bronze idols across Cholamandalam and even built a hospital in a village near Tanjavur. She would have been as powerful and well connected as any Chola queen, which was rare in those days. By the year 1012 CE, the 64-year-old Rajaraja crowned his son Rajendra as co-ruler. Rajendra was inheriting his kingdom at a very complex juncture for the Cholas. On the one hand, they were currently the most powerful Tamil kingdom in history, and neighboring rulers were tripping over themselves to offer gifts and assurances to the Chola throne. On the other hand, the Cholas had made some very powerful enemies. The western Chalukya dynasty was growing in power in the Deccan. The Cheras and Pandyas in the south were refusing to accept Chola sovereignty over their lands, and the kingdom was bigger and more culturally diverse than ever before. But before we get to that, I want to quickly show you what life would have been like in the Chola royal palace. Each morning, Rajendra would wake up in his luxurious bedchambers to the lilting tunes of palace musicians singing songs to Shiva and walk through the rich teakwood halls of the palace to his bathing pavilion. Here, a group of women known as Rajendra's service retinue would gently bathe the emperor with hot, fragrant water, apply sandalwood paste to his skin, and perfumed oil to his long hair and beard. They would then adorn the king in royal silks and glittering jewelry before he set foot in the court to begin yet another busy day of being emperor. These women of the service retinue have a tragic story that really shines a light on medieval Indian society. Many of them were actually once queens, princesses, and noblewomen belonging to wealthy families from all over the kingdom and beyond. When the king conquered a new land, he'd usually kill or imprison the enemy ruler and take his wives and daughters as his own personal servants, who'd attend on him in court, in the dining halls, and sometimes even in bed. To be clear, pretty much all Indian kings did this in the medieval era, not just the Cholas. But we know a lot about the women in the Chola palace because of temple inscriptions. You see, these women weren't just quiet servants who disappeared into the palace. Sometimes Chola kings even fell in love with women in their service retinues, preferring them to their actual queens. There's one more interesting way these women were involved in the Chola court. They often got into relations and had children with high-ranking Chola army officers. These officers commanded army regiments called the Kaikolar that mostly consisted of peasants, weavers and merchants. In fact, the Kaikolars still exist as a caste of weavers in Tamil Nadu today. The old king Rajaraja had very carefully cultivated the loyalties of these peasant militias so they'd come fight for him. The biggest army regiment under Chola control was known as the Great Army of the Right Hand, who were from northern Tamil Nadu, and Rajendra Chola had big plans for them. Now that his father had conquered Gangavadi in southern Karnataka, Rajendra had a brilliant idea. Since these Kaikolar armies were mainly farmers, why not give them some land in Gangavadi? The Kaikolar would get free farmland and the Cholas would have an army ready to attack the Chalukyas right there in Karnataka. Win-win! To seal the deal, Rajendra built the Kolarama temple in the town of Kolar and the Kaikolar army happily moved into their new lands. In fact, if you look at the temples around the Kolar and Bangalore regions in Karnataka, you'll see how more and more inscriptions were written in Tamil instead of Kannada as Chola influence grew in the region. Rajendra didn't have to wait long for the perfect opportunity to attack his rivals. The Chalukyas, who were busy fighting another kingdom in the north, had left their capital city of Manyakheta completely undefended. Manyakheta, that great medieval city, once the capital of the mighty Rashtrakutas, was a defenseless deer, and the crouching tiger of the Chola army tensed its muscles, ready to spring. On Rajendra's command, they pounced. His massive army marched straight through Manyakheta's gates, and the carnage that ensued is difficult to describe. The Chola army swept through the city, destroying and burning everything in their path, and the city went down in a giant blaze. When they were done, there was basically nothing left. Manyakheta was completely abandoned after this point, and the power balance in South India was completely overturned in favor of the Cholas. It was a historic victory for the young Rajendra, who celebrated with a massive procession through the streets of Tanjavur, where thousands of citizens would have lined the streets, cheering their king. By invading the Chalukya capital itself, he'd achieved what even his father Rajaraja hadn't been able to do. He deeply wounded the Chalukyas, leaving a mark that would be remembered for generations to come. But Rajendra was just getting started. It might surprise you to learn that despite his many military victories, Rajendra Chola was much more into politics and administration than he was into warfare. He knew that it wasn't really sustainable for him alone to manage every aspect of administration, trade and war, so he decided to delegate. He had 3 sons, the princes Alavantan, Dhabra and Veera, whom he designated to different parts of the kingdom. One in the Pandya lands, one in Chera territory, and one in Lanka. He also continued his father's work of centralizing the empire's system of taxation and governance, where Chola officials traveled the countryside, collecting taxes, resolving disputes, negotiating with nobles and landlords. This was done so that the center of power remained in the Chola court, not with local Nadu assemblies that would try to govern themselves. Meanwhile, some very interesting developments were taking place all the way across the Indian Ocean, in the busy waters connecting the various trading centers of the Sri Vijaya Empire in Indonesia. But the news wasn't exactly positive for the Cholas. The first bit of bad news came from the king of Angkor in Cambodia, who sent a message to Rajendra pleading him to help with a trade war he'd been having with Kedah, a hugely influential port in Malaysia. Apparently, the merchants of Kedah had been trying to monopolize trade in Southeast Asia, reducing profits for the Cambodians and Indonesians. But the second bit of bad news was what really angered Rajendra. Diplomats from Kedah had been going to the Emperor of China, claiming that the Cholas were actually just a vassal kingdom of the Sri Vijaya Empire and that they controlled all the trade coming out of the Tamil ports. Now this was too much. These Malaysian merchants were really overstepping their limits. If you watch part 1 of this series, you'll remember the Ainutravar or the 500, a coalition of Indian merchants who conducted trade as far away as the Middle East and China. The Ainutravar were getting deeply frustrated with the competition from Kedah and were trying to pressure Rajendra to do something about it. But first, he wanted the whole world to know that he, Rajendra Chola, first of his name, was the true king of kings, the rightful ruler of Tamilagam. He wanted to prove that he was chosen by God himself and silence his enemies once and for all. To do that, he would have to build a new temple, one that surpassed even his own father's mighty Brihadishwara temple. And crucially, he was going to consecrate it with water from the Ganga river, the ultimate act of ritual sanctification. As he looked north, over the hills and mountains, the forests and rivers that stood between him and the holy river 2000 kilometers away, he realized that this was a journey no other Tamil king before him had embarked on, and none would ever again. This was a journey that would make him immortal. And so, in the year 1022, Rajendra Chola prepared his great army. Foot soldiers, cavalry, spearmen, bowmen, sword fighters, drummers, elephant riders, flag bearers, cooks, blacksmiths, merchants, all set out on the road to the north. Standing in their way was a coalition of the Chalukyas and various kings of northern Andhra and Odisha. The very ground would have shaken under the thunderous march of Rajendra's dreadful cavalcade, a sight that would turn any opposing army weak in the legs. The enemy forces stood no chance against the Chola onslaught. Not only were Rajendra's armies much larger and better equipped, but they were constantly being supplied with hundreds of tons of food and resources every day from merchants who sailed in a fleet of ships along the east coast of India, following the course of the army's march. This incredibly well-organized supply chain allowed the Chola army to reach the marshes of Bengal in record time, giving the Pala kingdom no time to prepare a defense. Leading with his great squadron of armored war elephants, Rajendra collided with the Bengali army like a battering ram. The Palas were summarily routed, and all of a sudden, there they were. The massive army from the heart of Tamilagam were now standing on the banks of the holy river Ganga. Except for the Rashtrakutas, no other South Indian kingdom had managed to come this far north. The Cholas would no doubt have been glowing with pride as they filled great earthen pots with water from the Ganga to be hauled on the backs of elephants and bullock carts for the long and arduous journey back home. But the campaign had been worth it. In order to solidify his position as King of Kings, Rajendra commissioned a brand new temple to be built, the exquisite Gangaikonda Choleshwaram, or the temple of the Chola who sees the Ganga. This temple would be even more beautiful than his father's and would be at the center of the new Chola capital, Gangaikonda Cholapuram. And he would sanctify it by pouring the waters of the Ganga directly into the temple reservoir. Just imagine what a huge deal that would have been 1,000 years ago. Even today, hundreds of millions of Indians travel to the Kumbh Mela to bathe in the Ganga river. If you were a Tamil peasant 1,000 years ago, the Ganga would basically have been like a mythical river, so far away that you'd have only heard of it in stories and legends. Now imagine the holy river itself was brought to your very doorstep. And this was in a time long before modern transport and technology existed, so that water had to be carried 2,000 kilometers by hand to reach you. But even as the Chola royal court was basking in the glory of their colossal achievement, great political games were afoot in the port city of Nagapattinam, a major trading center for the Ainutravar and a place where Tamil people imported vast quantities of exotic goods from Southeast Asia. You've almost certainly come across camphor, those fragrant white drops that easily catch on fire and are central to every Hindu ritual. We take it for granted today, but 1,000 years ago, this waxy white substance was an unbelievable luxury sourced from the camphor tree found deep within the rainforests of Sumatra. The merchants of Kedah in Malaysia had shrewdly monopolized the sale of this priceless commodity, as well as many other exotic products from Indonesia, leaving no room for Tamil merchants to enter the market. Now, something you should know about the Ainutravar is that these weren't just ordinary traders. Many of them were politically connected magnates with a direct line of communication with the Chola king. If you think modern-day billionaires have too much power in Indian politics, these medieval tycoons were even capable of pressuring kings to declare war. In the case of Rajendra, he was angry enough at Kedah for trying to upstage the Cholas in front of the Chinese emperor. It didn't take much convincing to push him to take a drastic next step. There's a lot of debate about how exactly Rajendra Chola organized his campaign into Southeast Asia. Many believe the Cholas had developed a sophisticated naval fleet that could cross oceans and carry thousands of troops to foreign shores. But according to historian Anirudh Kanisetti, the archaeological evidence seems to be suggesting something very different.
I think all of us have this idea that Cholas are a thalassocratic empire. We think that they were an empire of the seas. But if you look at any of the great imperial Chola temples, if you look at, for example, once again the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjore, it has a whole basement that is covered in dozens upon dozens of long and detailed inscriptions telling you who are the people giving gifts. Of course, the king is giving gifts, the queens are giving gifts, princesses are giving gifts, but also officers, army regiments. And of course, given that conquest was so important, you have a lot of army regiments, army generals mentioned, but there are no mentions of navy regiments, of navy units, of naval officers, which is quite surprising given that you would expect that for such a society they would be equally careful about documenting the gifts given by ships' captains. But the people who do mention ships and who mention taxes on ships and who mention ships in the context of various gifts that they're giving are merchants.
When you look at all this evidence, a fascinating new possibility seems to emerge. Remember that the Ainutruvar supported the Cholas' march to the Ganga river by following them up the coast on ships. These merchants literally had a whole fleet of ships ready to go. What if, instead of spending crores on developing and organizing their own navy fleet, the Cholas instead collaborated with these powerful merchants and used their ships to transport troops and supplies from Tamil Nadu all the way to Indonesia? Of course, the journey would not have been easy. The Chola troops were a land-based army, and sailing for months on the open ocean without proper facilities would have been hell. Not only that, they needed to transport a number of war elephants and tons of food for the men and animals. They would have probably used ships like this, a Yatra Doni, typically 100 feet long and 20 feet wide, with cramped internal spaces and a makeshift shelter to protect sailors from the rain. Experienced Tamil sailors would have piloted the ships across the Indian Ocean, using the stars as their guide, twisting the sails in response to the shifting winds. By the time the Chola forces caught sight of the distant islands of Malaysia on the horizon, they'd have been frustrated, angry, and itching for a good fight. The Srivijaya Navy was caught completely by surprise. No one in history had dared to launch such an audacious attack from a foreign kingdom, let alone one that was nearly 3,000 kilometers away. The Chola ships slammed onto the shores of Kada, and Tamil warriors spilled out onto the Malaysian soil, screaming Rajendra's name as they broke down the city gates. Even the elephant corps of Kada stood no chance against the sudden wave of soldiers. The once proud city was brought to its knees. Even before the Chola invasion, the Srivijaya Empire had been a loose confederacy of wealthy ports at best. But as Chola ships spread out across the coast of Indonesia and Malaysia, subjugating local rulers and forcing them to pay tribute to Rajendra Chola, the Southeast Asian Empire completely collapsed. Many wealthy port cities sank into obscurity, while others squabbled with one another for dominance in the region. In one fell swoop, the Cholas had demolished their biggest trading rival and established control over much of Southeast Asia. From here on out, Tamil merchants began to settle all across Sumatra and the Malay coast, solidifying Chola influence and making a fortune in the process. These merchants even went so far as to import granite from Tamil Nadu all the way to Sumatra, just so they could build a Shiva temple there, which they dedicated to Rajendra Chola. In their inscriptions, they even gave him a new title, Kadaram Konda Chola, or the Chola who captured Kada. It seems that after years of planning and executing the most ambitious campaigns across India and Southeast Asia, Rajendra's fiery ambitions had cooled. He had nothing left to prove. He was now the most famous emperor in India and perhaps all of Asia. His subjects were tripping over themselves to build temples and give gifts in his name. Trade relations with Southeast Asia had significantly improved, and the Tamil country was prosperous and bountiful. Perhaps he'd just grown tired of the constant demands of war and statecraft, His sons were now ruling different parts of the kingdom, and Rajendra stopped allowing his queens to give temple gifts and do political lobbying. He found comfort in the arms of a lady in his service retinue named Paravai because she had no royal blood and would never be a threat to his queens or his sons. Meanwhile, Rajendra was also mentoring his nephew, a young boy named Rajiga, who was actually born in the Telugu-speaking kingdom of Vengi. Rajendra wanted to give the boy a proper Tamil education and perhaps groom him into a loyal vassal king one day. But nobody in the Chola court could have predicted what this young boy would one day achieve. We'll hear more from him very soon. By the time Rajendra's eldest son Alavantan, who adopted the imperial title of Rajadiraja Chola, took the throne in the year 1044, the political landscape of South India was looking very different compared to just a couple of decades ago. The western Chalukyas were just as powerful as ever, a constant source of anxiety for the Chola frontiers. And in the absence of Chola supervision, the people of Tondai in northern Tamil Nadu were starting to exercise too much autonomy in their daily affairs. Both of these issues would go on to plague the next three Chola emperors, almost destabilizing the empire. But for now, Rajadiraja was preparing for battle. Unlike his father or grandfather, he didn't have any interest in nation building or politics. He was an army man through and through. War was in his blood. For 3 long years after becoming emperor, Rajadiraja would lead his armies into battle after battle, clashing with Chalukya forces, crushing Lankan resistance, and burning villages and towns that stood in his way. And yet, nothing seemed to have a lasting effect. Every region he conquered would be resettled by Chalukya citizens after he left. Every victory came at a heavy cost, and nothing much was getting achieved. Meanwhile, the Chola treasury was being drained with each new campaign, and the emperor had not yet made a single temple grant anywhere in the kingdom. The Chalukya emperor at the time, Someshwara, was in many ways the exact opposite of Rajadiraja. While the Chola king was a bull in a china shop, impatiently planning campaigns and rushing headlong into battle, Someshwara was cautious and calculating in his actions, always preferring to wait for the right opportunity to react. The Chalukya king cleverly used his auxiliary forces like the Hoysalas and Kakatiyas to launch guerrilla attacks on Rajadiraja's supply lines, making every war a logistical nightmare for the Cholas. But Rajadiraja's campaigns did not go in vain. In the year 1050, he finally managed to storm Kalyana, the new capital of the Chalukyas, and sacked the city, burning it to the ground. For the first time in many years, the Chola court made an enormous gift to the Shiva temple at Ayyaru. Of course, that victory was short-lived after messengers informed Rajadiraja that while he was away in the Deccan, a Kakatiya raiding party had snuck into Tamil lands and raided Kanchi. You can imagine the raw fury the Chola emperor would have felt in that moment. This was no longer about conquest or supremacy. This had become personal. Rajadiraja would not be able to sleep at night until he had personally taken the life of his fiercest rival, the wily King Someshwara. But who could have told the Chola emperor that he was on a path that would lead to his own doom? As he planned his 4th expedition into the Deccan, Rajadiraja called on his younger brother, Prince Dhabra, to join him in battle. He named him his co-ruler, anointing the prince with a new name, Rajendra II. Together, they marched to the banks of the Tungabhadra river near the town of Koppam. But as Rajadiraja rode into battle atop his elephant, tragedy struck. For the first and only time in the Chola's storied history, a reigning emperor was killed in battle, struck by the enemy's arrows. His younger brother, Rajendra II, wasted no time in crowning himself emperor, and in a shock to the Chola royal family, he gave almost no titles or power to Rajadiraja's sons or his own younger brother Veera. Instead, Rajendra was only going to allow his own sons to hold any positions of power. But while all these wars and royal family drama were unfolding in the Chola capital, the kingdom's subjects were growing increasingly frustrated with how the Chola court had pretty much been ignoring their problems for the last decade. This shift was most keenly felt in the Tondai region of northern Tamil Nadu, which the Cholas had largely forgotten about.
For the most of the 11th century, even as all these tremendous geopolitical changes are happening outside, strangely the nature of the Chola state does not really change that much. you see that the revenue secretariat, who are the main senior bureaucrats around the king, remain mostly drawn from the Kaveri floodplain itself. Even though the Cholas have become a trans-regional empire that extends into South Karnataka, that extends into the northern part of Tamil Nadu, known as Tondai Nadu, it does not have a lot of officers who are coming from these regions and are helping to administer these on the behalf of the Cholas. So what these people start to do is they start to form their own collective assemblies and they start nudging back against Chola power. So in 1063, you have this remarkable organization that develops called the Chitrameli Periyanadu, which means the Great Nadu of the Shining Plough. So it is an association of cultivators of a huge swathe of northern Tamil Nadu who sit together and say, we are going to pay only this much rate on such and such crops, on such and such crops. They are not referring to the orders of any Chola king. They are saying that we have decided that we are going to pay only this much tax, right? So clearly there are these internal contradictions and cracks that are beginning to appear because the nature of the state is not representing its people. The capacity of the state is not enough to govern these wide, far-flung and diverse territories.
This Chitrameli Periyanadu, which we'll call the Shining Plough, was essentially a collective of powerful landlords and wealthy men who decided, if the Cholas aren't going to help us out, we'll start governing ourselves. So instead of going through the official channels of the court, they began to handle everything from resolving local disputes to temple renovations to irrigation of farmland, all by themselves. And it doesn't seem like the emperor understood the gravity of the situation because Rajendra II didn't really do anything about the Shining Plough. But the other men of the Chola court began to notice the cracks in the empire's foundations and began to set their own plans in motion. That included the emperor's younger brother, Veera, because when Rajendra II suddenly died, he was right there to sweep up the crown. In the span of just 20 years, 3 sons of Rajendra I had sat on the Chola throne in an empire where once a single king would rule for 20 or 30 years straight. But there was one major change that occurred under the rule of the new emperor, now crowned as Veera Rajendra. For almost 80 years now, every Chola emperor had been absorbed with constant wars against the western Chalukyas, a rivalry that showed no signs of ending anytime soon. Local warlords and kings were tired of the constant fighting and put pressure on both the Chola and Chalukya emperors to stop the violence. After what was nearly 2 human lifetimes in those days, Veera Rajendra Chola and Vikrama Chalukya, son of Someshwara, embraced, agreeing to set aside their weapons and work together peaceably. But for the old Chalukya emperor Someshwara, who'd spent his entire long life fighting the Cholas and watched his capital city burn at their hands, a peace treaty between his own son and the sworn enemy felt like the greatest betrayal. Consumed by sorrow, Someshwara committed ritual suicide by drowning in 1068. It was the end of an era for South India. As peace settled over the land, something most peasants and their lords were entirely unfamiliar with. But in the next chapter of the Chola story, things get far more interesting when the Chola royal line abruptly comes to an end and a familiar newcomer rises to power. By the way, if you're enjoying this so far, please don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. Now back to the video. Remember Rajiga, that young Telugu boy who'd been raised in the Chola court by Rajendra I and his sons? Well, now he was a grown man in his 40s, hardened in battle and experienced in regional politics. For the last 2 decades, he'd been a loyal servant of the Cholas, fighting for them in Vengi and leading armies into battle against the Chalukyas.
Rajiga is not really a Chola in the paternal line. His mother and grandmother are Chola princes, but he's actually a Vengi Chalukya who comes from the east coast in the delta between the Krishna and Godavari rivers. He grew up in the Chola court and he has a very keen understanding not just of the military elites, but he also has connections in these very different places that are on the frontiers of the Chola kingdom.
But now, the Emperor Veera Rajendra had fallen fatally ill and knew there wasn't much time left. He had a son Adi Rajendra, who he crowned the new emperor, but the boy was still too young and inexperienced. Out of options, the old king chose the only man he thought he could trust, the grizzled Rajiga, to be co-ruler with his son. Except even the boy was sickly, and within just a few months of his coronation, succumbed to illness and died. In a completely unexpected turn of events, this outsider, son of one of the daughters of Rajendra I, who was only ever going to be the king of Vengi, was now the supreme monarch of the most powerful Tamil empire. As he sat uneasily on the throne, bereft of any close allies in the court at Gangaikonda Cholapuram, Rajiga Chalukya adopted his new imperial title, Kulottunga Chola, first of his name. But none of that changed the fact that he, the son of a Telugu-speaking king of Vengi, was an outsider in the Chola court, a space dominated by nobility from the Kaveri floodplain. He'd spent most of his life fighting wars for the Cholas in the north and had little time to build up connections in the Tamil heartland. For a lesser man, the pressures of managing a disorganized empire, combined with the lack of support in his own palace, would have been enough to destabilize his grip on the throne. But Kulottunga was up to the task.
So when he takes the throne in 1072, there's a huge change in the nature of the Chola state, in that suddenly it is not being run by the Kaveri people for the Kaveri people. Kulottunga comes, actually he sends officers to Kolar, not far from Bangalore, and he makes a deal with the Tamil settlers there. He invites a whole bunch of warlords from Tondai Nadu to join his administration as various ministers and generals. So the nature of the Chola state changes. It becomes much more multi-ethnic, much more diverse. But on the other hand, in order to become this, it has to give up on those wide-ranging military expeditions. So from being a continental superpower, it becomes a much more contained regional power.
Crucially, Kulottunga managed to convince his subjects that he was focused on solving the problems of people within his empire, not constantly worry about conquering this or that kingdom in the distant borders of the Chola Empire. He put an end to the Chola tradition of raiding neighboring kingdoms to finance the state because it constantly led to expensive, tiring wars. Instead, he enacted sweeping tax reforms across the empire. Now, Kaveri cultivators would have to pay higher tax, but it was much more standardized, and Kulottunga even minted copper coins so that farmers could sell their produce in the market, then pay their taxes using those coins, which increased profits for the farmers and simplified the tax collection process. In fact, his status as an outsider from the Kaveri heartland meant that Kulottunga was popular among his subjects all over the empire, from Gangavadi in the west to Tondai in the north. Even the shining plough assembly stopped their operations, happy to pay the Cholas taxes since they were getting direct support from the court. For the next 3 decades, the Chola Empire prospered under the capable rule of this outsider emperor, and its treasury grew with its healthy tax base from all over its vast territories. But you should know by now that there's no such thing as a status quo in the world of medieval India, because new powers are always emerging and new socioeconomic forces are reshaping the landscape. As we shall see, the successors of Kulottunga would recognize these changes happening within their kingdom, but their ability to shape those changes would slowly grow weaker and weaker with each new emperor that sat on the throne. Despite his best efforts, Kulottunga's reign wasn't free of military conflict. In the latter half of his rule, the Cholas invaded the Kalinga kingdom in Odisha twice. The first time because the Kalinga king tried to attack Vengi, and the second time because the king hadn't paid his dues to the Cholas. That second campaign was led by a dashing general, Karunakara Tondaiman, who was part of a growing number of warlords from the Tondai region who were getting worryingly powerful and wealthy. These lords employed large numbers of people, donated heavily to temples, and seemed to be trying to exercise their own independence across Tamil Nadu. In fact, there was a stark demographic shift taking place across Cholamandalam.
So as long as the wealth is coming in from conquest, the Cholas are able to keep taxes on the Nadus very low. But what happens on the conquest end? You have to raise taxes. So Kulottunga Chola, he has this extensive administrative revamp. He conducts various land surveys and he begins to increase taxes, which is still okay. But then when there's natural disasters, then the system starts to crumble. In the early 12th century, under Kulottunga's son Vikrama Chola, you have a series of devastating floods in the northern part of Tamil Nadu. But what happens is that a lot of villages now are driven into bankruptcy because they don't have harvest, they're not able to pay the high tax rates. And so in order to pay off the debt, they are forced to sell their lands. The thing is that the Chola court itself no longer has the wealth to buy these lands, but the ones who do have it are the warlords. These military entrepreneurs who have made fortunes fighting the Cholas' wars are now coming in and they start to buy large quantities of land. Now, gradually, the generals begin to take over the temples. Because they control the land, they start gifting the land to the temples. It is no longer possible for the Cholas to tax the temples. And so, what begins to happen is that the temples are gradually taken away from the arms of the Chola state and instead become nodes for the building of wealth and the dissemination of messaging by various landlords and magnates.
Of course, we now see this as a problem, but at the time, this was seen as practically a golden age for the Cholas. There was peace and prosperity, at least for the wealthy elite, and the middle class also found many new opportunities. But things would progressively get worse for the poorest class of society, as we'll see very soon. 30 years after the death of Kulottunga I, the Chola kingdom was well and truly caught in the snowball effect of temple-based tax evasion in the Tamil country. By now, Tamil temples were the largest landowners and employers practically anywhere in India, and they grew into these bustling economic zones where communities gathered, commerce boomed, and the Tamil arts flourished. This great wave of temple building would later become known as the third urbanization of India, the other two being the Indus Valley civilization and the settling of the Gangetic Plain in North India. But over decades of losing valuable tax revenue to nobles who donated all their land to temples, the Chola treasury was effectively depleted, leaving the current king Rajaraja II penniless in the 1160s. This was when a shadowy figure who was close to the emperor suddenly seized control of the Chola court in a sort of hostile takeover. We don't know much about this person, only that he was called the Pallava Little King, and soon after his name appears, the emperor suddenly dies, leaving behind only infant sons. Highly suspicious. Going forward, the Pallava Little King and his family would act as puppeteers of the boy king Rajadiraja II, forcing him to approve land grants and titles to the Pallava Little King's family. But outside the walls of the Chola palace, the kingdom was sinking deeper and deeper into anarchy. Warlords were seizing more and more land and forcing farmers to work in them. You see, while the temples technically owned the land, these lords still retained the right to cultivate it, which meant that not only did they not have to pay taxes, but the farmers who actually cultivated the land had to pay rent to the lords and still had to pay taxes to the Chola state. There's an eerie parallel to the modern day in the way these wealthy warlords exploited tax exemptions to get filthy rich. In those days, rich people found a loophole in the government's revenue model, using land owned by temples to extract rent and profits. Today, rich people's wealth lies in company stocks, which can't be taxed unless they're sold. So they use their stocks as collateral to borrow huge sums of money from banks, only paying back the interest and essentially living tax-free despite owning mansions, private islands, and yachts. Meanwhile, it's the middle class who are stuck paying rent to greedy landlords and still paying taxes to the government, which actually keeps the country functioning. In both cases, short-sightedness and a lack of safeguards led to a snowballing capitalist disaster that widened the wealth gap between the rich and the poor. And for the poorest Tamil peasants, the situation was horrible. There are actual surviving records of lower caste peasants who, left with no options, were forced to sell themselves, their families, and their future generations to slavery. One bone-chilling bonded labor contract from the 13th century reads, "They, the enslaved people, are to husk paddy for the feeding hall of the god, and those who are their descendants are to continue this paddy husking for as long as the sun and moon shall shine." Amidst all this, the Pandya kingdom in the south was on the rise again. Their king, Maravarman, nursed a deep-seated hatred for the Cholas, who for the last 2 centuries had repeatedly raided his lands, destroyed his city, and subjugated his people. Now, leading his massive army of elite cavalry troops towards the Chola capital, he was determined to have his revenge. Over the last several years, the Pandyas had followed a trend that was pioneered by the Mongol Empire. Instead of slow infantry or elephant armies, they built up a large force of fast-moving cavalry that could cross hundreds of kilometers in mere days. Both the Pandyas and the Hoysalas had spent massive sums on importing the best horses from Central Asia and Arabia and were now itching to unleash them. The Pandyas burst onto the fertile Kaveri floodplain, destroying everything in their path. They first demolished Tanjavur, then continued on to the rest of the Chola kingdom. They didn't care about conquering, they just wanted to terrorize. The Cholas by now didn't even have the martial strength to oppose them and had to desperately call for help from their allies, the Hoysalas. For the next several years, the Pandyas and Hoysalas would periodically skirmish with one another, essentially turning the old Chola heartland into their bloody playground. But the final blow to the tottering Chola Empire came many years later, towards the end of the 13th century. It was quite fitting that the Cholas went out with a bang, not a whimper. The last emperor was a surprisingly energetic man named Rajendra III, who amassed what little armies he could and set out to attack the Pandyas once more. The Pandyas were having a succession crisis and even the Hoysalas were weakened, so they couldn't interfere. Could this actually be a chance for the Cholas to win back their long-lost glory? For 7 years, Rajendra kept his crumbling kingdom in one piece, beating back the Pandyas further south. But then, a powerful young king, Jatavarman Pandya, rose to the throne and swore to end the Cholas once and for all. As he slowly moved north, he trampled every army that stood against him, even the Hoysalas. In one final death blow to the exhausted Cholas, he laid waste to their capital, Gangaikonda Cholapuram, and unlike his predecessors, he actually settled in the Kaveri region, making the fertile plains his new center of power. We don't really know what happened to Rajendra III or when he died. He simply disappeared from all inscriptional records after 1279. Only their ancient enemy, the Pandyas, saw fit to write them a final, brief eulogy. The Chola tiger was sent off to rule in the forests. And with that, the epic saga of the Chola Empire came to an end. I want to conclude with this one interesting development that took place in the 12th and 13th centuries, at a time when Chola control over their territory was slowly slipping away. This period once more saw the rise of the shining plough, that collective of peasants, merchants and Brahmins who chose to govern themselves instead of depending on an unreliable king. To grow their numbers, they began allowing even more castes into their group. But even so, the lowest castes like weavers, artisans and pariahs weren't allowed to be a part of this collective. Knowing that they needed to band together if they wanted to avoid ruthless exploitation, the lowest caste groups came together in their own collective that they called the Left Hand. The name was a reference to the derogatory term used by higher caste members to mock the lower castes as dirty or impure. So the Left Hand collective decided to own the name as their identity. Eventually, they became so large and powerful that the shining plough felt threatened, and so they started their own caste alliance called the Right Hand. These left and right hand collectives would continue to exist for the next 500 years and were still around when the British Raj established the Madras Presidency. In a way, I think these left hand and right hand people are the perfect metaphor for India as a whole, both ancient and modern. As complex and divisive as this kind of caste politics is, for better or worse, that's what makes India, India. Within every society in our country lies endless complexity and layers that go deeper and deeper. But ultimately, the story of even these hopelessly segregated communities is the story of people getting together to survive. Because even in the face of class divides and cultural disharmony, we still crave belonging. We want community. We need each other. Thank you so much for watching. This video would not have been possible without the help of Anirudh Kanisetti and the pioneering historical research in his new book, Lords of Earth and Sea. If you're an Indian history buff and want to learn about Chola life in even greater detail, you should absolutely pick up your own copy. You can find a link below in the description. Please subscribe to my channel and share this video with your friends and family. It'll help me create even more high quality history documentaries like this. I'm Anish Bhargav and I'll see you in the next one.